Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Do you remember when football players wore stickum? Do you remember when the NBA played defense? Do you remember when Wrigley Field turned on the lights? If so, then this podcast is for you. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together. We're here to discuss iconic sports moments, teams, and athletes from our generation. This is GenX Classic Sports, sports talk for Gen Xers, by Gen Xers.
Okay, Dylan, welcome back. This is going to be episode 9. This topic will be the 1989 NFL Draft. And you came to Dad here and you said, by the way, for those that didn't listen to episode 8, this is my son Dylan helping out. He's a future sports journalist who is, a big Gen X sports, music, pop culture of all kinds kind of kid. He grew up as a kid of YouTube, so he knows as much about the era that I grew up in probably as I do. He came to me with this topic. So Dylan, why were you so determined for us to have this as a topic?
Well, you asked me about what topic I'd like to talk about. I think I just seen an Instagram post about it like earlier that day, and I was like, that's obviously in that time frame that you're looking for, and that's a pretty big moment in NFL history, and especially draft history, when you have 4 first-round Hall of Famers drafted in the top 5 picks, and sandwiched in between all of these first-ballot Hall of Famers, you have one of the biggest draft busts of all time.
Yeah, that's what makes it intriguing. Of course, we'll break all that down for everybody here in just a second. But yeah, it's, when I thought of drafts, when we started the podcast and I started thinking about drafts, which ones would I like to talk about? The 83 draft came up. David, Mark, Casey, someone said, well, the 83 draft is, for the NFL at least, is worth talking about. And of course, that's the quarterback draft that everybody knows about. So, definitely. But, I'm fine with talking about this one because I think there's definitely a lot of interesting storylines here. So, let me get the particulars out of the way then, and you can jump in here in a second. We just set the stage on an earlier episode of how the Cotton Bowl in 1989, it had a lot to do with setting the stage for the draft. So the draft, as usual, the NFL draft in 1989 was in New York, and it was April 23rd, a 2-day event. And you mentioned it earlier, but by the way, back then there were 335 picks over 12 rounds. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I find interesting is that Troy Aikman actually went to the draft, and no one had really done that. Troy was told by his agent, Lee Steinberg, that it would probably be a good idea for him to go to the draft and hang out. And I don't know what all went into that, but that started the trend of the players actually showing up at the draft, which I find, really kind of a cool little moment in sports. Do you have a pen in here anywhere?
I can find it. It's probably over there. There is one.
Grab it or a pencil, anything, if you don't mind, just really quick. Headphones. Okay, so yeah, it was April 23rd. New York, 335 picks, 12 rounds, Aikman attends. Okay, you mentioned this earlier as well. What was unique about Barry Sanders' role in this draft?
Well, specifically just the Heisman race in general. The year prior, in 1988, there was 2 quarterbacks like usual that get hyped up in the preseason. And then all of a sudden, Barry Sanders, who was already pretty highly valued, like running back prospect coming into the season, sets basically every rushing record in a season, runs for 2,600 yards. I think it's 30 touchdowns, like something ridiculous. And all of a sudden, he's a cemented top 5 pick that's going to go to some team to be a franchise.
Yeah, but what else was it that you mentioned earlier about him that was a little bit unusual about his status?
Oh, yes.
His age.
He was the first player, or at least the first recognized player that was allowed to enter the draft as a junior instead of a senior. That's why it was baffling to me that all of these senior prospects were playing in all these meaningless bowl games, because they weren't allowed to go to the NFL yet.
Yeah. So Barry declared for the draft as a junior, which wasn't allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason and I didn't remember this, but the reason they let him go ahead and be in the draft is because OSU was about to get Oklahoma State, where he went, was about to get hammered with NCAA rules violations. Yep. And I don't think it was anything he was necessarily directly involved in as far as his recruitment or getting paid to play or any of that. It's just the program was about to sustain a penalty. And so for whatever reason, the NFL and the NCAA allowed it to happen. And probably it's not like this was a center or a punter. This was the most dominant offensive person on the field that whole season. And so the old excuse of, well, he may not physically be ready just didn't mean anything that year because he was so dominant. The rule where juniors were not eligible was completely demolished after that. After Barry did it, they took that rule away, and that's where people started declaring as juniors and allowed to be part of the draft. So, yeah, Barry Sanders, trendsetter. Mm-hmm. And I do remember how big of a deal that was. Okay, so setting the stage a little bit more. The season of 1988, you had Aikman, you had Rodney Peete was a big name quarterback. You had some receivers and running backs and things, but the big name, of course, on the running back list was Barry. There was actually a couple of dominant defensive players that were also on the board that caused a little intrigue. And one of them was Derrick Thomas coming out of Alabama. Yep. And then Deion Sanders was a part of this draft. And so, everything you know about Deion was true then. All the talk about how dominant he was, all the talk about how good he was going to be as a pro, all the talk about how much of a freak athlete he was, all of that was legit even back then. So you had Deion, you had
Derrick Thomas,
you had Aikman. So you had some weapons on both sides of the ball that were big stories that made for a pretty intriguing draft. Do you know if Mel Kiper was doing his thing back then or not? What year did he start?
Well, he wrote almanacs, like draft guides every single year. But the year that he I can't remember specifically what year it was, but the year that the Colts passed up on a quarterback and their GM at the time got on a call with Mel Kiper at the draft.
Yeah, they play that every year.
Yeah, and that was the year that they signed Harbaugh on free agency. And they basically chose to keep Harbaugh over any draft prospects at the time, which I think Trent Dilfer was one, so whichever class that was. But that was the year that Kiper really changed the draft. But before then, he was writing guides.
Right. So, okay. So, let's that's 7-8 minutes of just introducing and setting the stage again. So, let's dive into a little bit about what happened. So, it was a no-brainer what was going to happen in the first pick because of what I talked about with the Cotton Bowl. Troy Aikman was clearly the big physical, big-armed, semi-mobile guy that was fit perfectly in a pro-style offense. That's what he ran at UCLA. If you're Dallas picking first, you draft a guy like that and you make it work offensively. So it wasn't Tom Landry that got to do it. It ended up being Jimmy. But Troy Aikman, clearly not a problem. No one had a problem with him going number one. Number two, the second pick, was a guy named Tony Mandarich, and you mentioned that as an intriguing part of the story. Tony Mandarich was on the front of Sports Illustrated, and he was called, leading into the draft, the best offensive lineman prospect that ever lived. Mm-hmm. He was 6'6", he was 330 pounds. That was not normal back
Mostly
then.
like lean muscle too.
Pretty
it wasn't
lean
just
muscle,
fat.
strong. That was not, nowadays no one bats an eye over those numbers. Mm-hmm. That was not normal back then.
No.
That was several inches taller and 40 pounds of muscle more than a lot of guys.
And I even saw a stat that in the 80s at some time period there was only 4 players in the league over 300 pounds.
Right.
And now there's over 400 players
Yeah, there
in the
was
league.
Refrigerator Perry and a handful of 3-4 others, and that was it. Correct. Tony Mandrich, he was a can't-miss, absolute, no doubt about it, offensive tackle. I guess he was a tackle.
He was.
Yeah, and he was going to be the best thing that ever played on the line. And did it turn out that way for the number 2 pick?
No, it was a complete bust. Basically, he was roided up the whole time, and he was technically not, from a technical standpoint, he was not as good of a tackle that could have translated to the NFL better. And when he started going up against like the Reggie Whites of the world and eventually Derrick Thomas, he stood no chance.
Yeah, so in 88 or 89, somewhere in there, I was in high school, and I was writing a speech about steroids. You had to kind of do a research paper type thing and give a speech about it. I picked steroid abuse in pro sports, and I think I ended up narrowing it down to pro football. And I can't remember if that was in 89 when after people came out and sort of suspected that was his deal or not, but I know later on when the story broke that he was on roids, it didn't surprise me at all because I had been reading about how they were abused for NFL linemen and so forth. So Mandrich was the number 2 pick. You want to talk about him while we're on the number 2 pick really quickly? Some stuff I found out about. Just it doesn't do anything for me to just say the guy was a bust. There's more to that story. So the guy was 6'6". He was 330. People suspected that maybe the guy's on roids. If you've seen the SI cover with him wearing nothing but a pair of shorts and a backwards cap on, you'd know what we're talking about. He came to camp late. That was problem number 1. He held out for his contract. Back then, they weren't automatic contracts. He held out. He didn't join his team until right before camp ended in the regular season, or in the regular season started. So he was behind, and he had been so dominant in college. And what he admitted to later, after a lot of stuff happened, was that yes, he was on roids all the way through high school and college. And he actually claims that he quit taking steroids before the NFL draft because he knew their standards for testing were so much more advanced than anything he had done in college and high school. And he knew that he couldn't cheat like he did in college and high school on any drug tests. And so he stopped. Well, when he stopped, he lost a lot of strength and endurance and so forth. And he just wasn't physically the same guy, for one thing. So he shows up late. He plays 4 years for the Packers. He does not start his first year. He's so far behind mentally, and he's off the roids now, so his strength is just average. And there were talk among the Packers linemen of, why is this guy, we're whipping this guy regularly. What's the big deal with him? So his reputation was ruined the day he stepped on the field because he's getting blown up by everybody. He played special teams some his rookie year, and that was it. He started for the next 2 years, and they said there was no Pro Football Focus back then, but by reputation alone, among his own teammates even, he was categorized as average.
Yeah.
He wasn't a dominant. He wasn't the worst, but he wasn't dominant like he was in college whatsoever. He was just a plug-in average. So he wasn't living up to his contract is what that amounts to. 4 years in, when he's around the end of his rookie contract, he gets concussed so badly in the preseason or in training camp, I can't remember. He missed the entire season. His concussion was so bad, which, if you think about back then...
Yeah, for those standards, that's really bad.
He was out for the whole year. And for the way they used to push guys into play, and that's hard to believe. He was 6'6", 330 pounds, but he also ran a 4.65 40-yard dash. And at the combine, he bench pressed 225 pounds at the time, an unheard of 39 times. And you know what his nickname was?
The Incredible Bulk.
The Incredible Bulk.
That's on the cover of
That's
SI.
on that cover of SI. I think he made another cover or two.
He did after when he turned out to be a bust. They had a big cover with him and pads on it that said the NFL's biggest bust.
Yeah.
I had him on it.
So for this fourth season, He missed for concussion, and it's coming back to me. I see a note that reminded me. So he missed the fourth season. His fifth season, which would have been his final year of his contract, the Pack lost interest and cut him. Ron Wolf had enough, and he cut him. Now, he had a reputation for other things, too, partying and not focusing on what he was supposed to do. So there's plenty of documentation about that, but we don't get on this. We try not to just talk about negative stuff on the old podcast here. We try to appreciate what these guys did. And so he loses a year to concussion. He gets cut. This dude sat out for 5 years. So there's a little bit of a redemption story here with him. He sat out for 5 seasons, and he got his life back together. He got sober. He tried to get his body right, deal with the concussion stuff and all that. And he came back. He came back for after 5 seasons. Think about that, 5 seasons as an offensive lineman. He came back, and he played 3 additional seasons with the Colts. So he played 7 or 8 years, or he was under contract for 7 or 8 years, however you want to look at it. And when he came back with the Colts, he once again had some injury problems. But once again, he was deemed as kind of just an average guy that you would draft in the middle of the draft or end of the draft and plug him in there. But he was never dominant, never, ever, ever dominant. He was an average offensive lineman. Funny footnote in history, he played. Do you know where he played college ball?
I can't remember. I'm guessing it'd be like a Big Ten school.
He played college ball at Michigan State.
Yeah.
Why would you say you guessed it was a Big Ten school? That's a good guess. Why would you say that?
I mean, that's just their reputation.
Big lineman?
Wisconsin, Nebraska.
Yeah, he went to Michigan State, and he was recruited there by their defensive coordinator, who was a dude named Nick Saban.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, that's a funny little footnote in history.
Oh, wouldn't he have been their head coach at the time?
No, he later was their head
coach.
coach.
That's right. He went to Toledo, too.
He was their defensive coordinator at the time. So that takes care of numbers 1 and 2. Troy Aikman went first to the Cowboys. Number 2, Green Bay drafted Tony Mandrich out of Michigan State, and we just told his story. Who was number 3, Dylan?
Well, can't remember specifically. Was that Barry?
That was Barry Sanders.
Yeah, that was
the
Barry.
best running back in the draft by far was Barry Sanders.
And of all time.
And Detroit was Detroit. They needed all the help they can get, and they picked Barry Sanders. And like we said, he came off a Heisman Trophy season and a 2,000-yard, 30-touchdown season as well. By the way, footnote also, when I went to football camp at University of Arkansas back then, it was actually that year, in '88, the summer, we met their strength coach, and he was one of the biggest dudes I'd ever seen. And you know what his calling card claim to fame was?
What?
He had just left Oklahoma State, and he told us straight up, "I'm the guy that put those thighs on Barry Sanders." And he went on to he coached Thurman Thomas, he coached Barry Sanders, and he coached Barry Foster.
Yeah.
And he knew what he was doing with building a dude's lower body, trust me. So, number 3, Detroit Lions, Barry Sanders from Oklahoma State. That gets us to number 4, and it's time for a defensive player. And by the way, we're not going to go through every pick, but we're going to make special note of these for a reason. So the 4th pick was,
Deion.
Defense.
Deion or Derrick Thomas?
Derrick Thomas.
Derrick Thomas. Cool.
Derrick Thomas came from Alabama, and he was just a tackling, sacking machine.
Monster.
He was just, he was kind of like a Lawrence. I mean,
he truly is the closest thing that we've ever gotten to Lawrence Taylor, and it's a shame that he ended up having to pass away early in his career. Well, early by most standards, but he was genuinely the closest thing to Lawrence Taylor. He was a machine.
He was a machine. He was a wrecking crew for sure. And he, he was kind of one of those, you hope he's a no-doubter because he certainly looked like the part and sounded like it and everything. And he was the real deal, Derrick Thomas. A lot of people loved that guy for sure. All right, staying on the defensive side is number 5, and that would be your guy Deion Sanders, who was drafted by the Falcons out of Florida State. And we're going to talk about Deion some more later because I'm going to do a great athlete series, and he'll be one of them. Deion, there's a funny story about him in the draft that I always like because he was at the combine, and somebody was wanting to put him through this 2.5-hour test. And they just kind of caught him in the hallway. It wasn't a formal thing, but they were like, "Hey, we need you for 2 and you know they're busy 24 hours a day there. They barely let them get any rest because they're constantly interviewing. I think it was the Giants.
Oh yeah.
Said, hey, we'd like
this.
to talk to you and take this test, and it's going to take about 2.5 hours." And he said, "When do you draft? What pick do you have?" And they said whatever they said, 8 or 9. He goes, "Dude, I'm not even going to be there that late. No thanks," and kept rolling because he knew he was going to be in the top 5. I mean, you can make a case that Deion could have gone anywhere from 2 to 5, really.
Mm-hmm.
So Deion gets drafted by the Falcons. There's no surprise there that he was the first defensive back to get drafted. Not a shocker there whatsoever. So that's 5 picks.
Mm-hmm.
Troy Aikman, Tony Mandrich, Barry Sanders, Derrick Thomas, and Deion Sanders. How many of them made the Hall of Fame, Dylan?
4 of them.
4 of them made the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and there's no stretch like that to start the draft ever.
And some of the best at their position ever.
Some of the best at their positions ever, and there's no start to any draft that went that well for 4 out of 5 teams. Unbelievable. Let me give you a few numbers on these guys before we move into some more notables. Aikman ended up in 6 Pro Bowls, won 3 Super Bowls, and was a Super Bowl MVP, Hall of Famer. Barry Sanders, Pro Bowler, Hall of Famer. Derrick Thomas, Pro Bowler, Hall of Famer. Deion, I can't even remember how many Pro Bowls he made, but he was the Hall of Famer as well. And, you know, they weren't the only ones. Here's what's super interesting about it, is not only did 4 of the top 5 go to the Hall of Fame, there's another guy that was all the way down there at 20, and his name was Steve Atwater from the Arkansas Razorbacks.
Mm-hmm.
And the Broncos made him the 20th pick, and guess what he did? He played in Pro Bowls, and he made the Hall of Fame. And how do you and I know that he made the Hall of Fame?
Because we were there.
We were there. Dylan and I were very fortunate, and David, and we made a trip to Canton. Our only time we've ever done it, to see Jimmy Johnson and Steve Atwater and lots of other guys go into the Hall of Fame a few years ago, and it was worth every bit of the trip because that was just an awesome experience. Steve Atwater, one of the best safeties you'll ever see in your life, and we'll talk about him later because we're probably, if I was a betting man, I'd say we're going to end up talking about a guy named Christian Okoye at some point on here. So 6 guys in the top 20 made the Hall of Fame. Let me give you some other notable names, Dylan. Have you ever heard of a guy named Eric Metcalf?
Yep. From Arkansas.
No.
Oh, no, my bad.
What was he? Do you know what he was? He was from Texas. But do you know what he was famous for?
Nah.
He was one of those running back, receiver, return guys.
Yeah.
He did everything, and I've loved him as a pro. He played for the Browns, and I wouldn't even say he was who's the Desmond Howard? Not Desmond Howard. Who's the return guy that just went in?
Devin Hester.
Devin Hester. He wasn't that dominant, but Eric Metcalf could do everything. He could play anything that involved catching or running with the football on offense and special teams. He was a really, really fun guy to watch. Wayne Martin from Arkansas. Remember the guy I just told you was a defensive end and got suspended from the Cotton Bowl for Arkansas. He went number 19. He was a Pro Bowler. The Saints picked up him on the 19th pick. Eric Metcalf went 13th to the Browns. Both of those guys were Pro Bowlers. The very next pick after Wayne Martin was Steve Atwater at number 20. Here's some other names from the same draft, lest you wonder who else might have been involved. Andre Rison.
Mm-hmm.
And what college did he go to, Dylan?
I could not tell you.
He was a Michigan State guy, and he got drafted got drafted by the Colts, and he was a Pro Bowler.
Mm-hmm.
There was another guy on this after that named Carnell Lake.
Mm-hmm.
He was a safety. Remember I told you UCLA had a lot of good players? He was one of them. He made the Pro Bowl. He was number 34. At number 39, there was a guy who had a big imprint on NFL rushing statistics historically, and his name was Daryl Johnston from Syracuse, and he opened up most of the holes that Emmitt Smith ran through on the line for a long time, and he was a Pro Bowler. Speaking of the Cowboys, at number 57, there was another guy named Mark Stepnoski from Pitt. Pitt's known for some of their nasty lineman types, too. Mark Stepnoski to the Cowboys from Pitt, a center. Another Cowboy at number 85, Tony Tolbert. He was a defensive end from UTEP. He made the Pro Bowl. So did Stepnoski. So did Darrell Johnston. And at 132, there was a guy named Dave Meggett. Who was Dave Meggett?
No idea.
Dave Meggett was what I sort of just mentioned, like the Eric Metcalf mold. Dave Meggett was a smaller running back, kind of a third down back we used to call him. Caught a lot of passes, played in a lot of specialty situations, maybe red zone type things, and caught a lot of passes out of the backfield. And he was a big part of Parcells' offense when he was with the Giants. Dave Meggett, smaller guy, but Dave Meggett, Pro Bowler at pick number 132. So those are the biggest names that I could find on the list. I'm sure I missed a name or two, but that was a pretty big draft. It's hard to argue with 6 Pro Bowlers or 6 Hall of Famers in the first 20 picks.
Yep.
Arkansas, going back to the Arkansas connection, Arkansas had 7 guys drafted. You know, if you think about really dominant college programs right now, how many guys usually does, and by the way, the draft is not 12 rounds anymore.
No.
It's 7. It was 12 back then. How many guys does a good Alabama, Georgia, or Clemson team nowadays put in the draft?
On average, anywhere from like 5 to 10.
7, 8, 10, yeah.
If it's a really good year, it's 10.
6 on the low side, 10 or 11 on the high side. So Arkansas was right there in that range, of course, with 5 more rounds. Arkansas had 7 people drafted, and since we have a lot of Arkansas fans that listen, Freddie Childress, the offensive guard or tackle that we talked about earlier that was so big, he was one of them. There was a linebacker for Arkansas named Kerry Owens who was drafted. There was a defensive back, a really good one that I remember named Richard Brothers that was drafted. Their kicker Kendall Traynor was drafted, and there was another running back named LaSalle Harper, or a linebacker named LaSalle Harper that was drafted also. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Was Barry Foster was part of that as well. Or he would have been whenever he got drafted. May have been the next year, I can't remember. But yeah, so 7 Razorbacks. Obviously Atwater was one of them. Pretty good year for them as well. By the way, the total out of all the players drafted, the total number of Pro Bowlers was 24 to go along with the 6 Hall of Famers. And honestly, the Pro Bowl to me isn't the gold standard anymore. It's just a fan popularity contest. But back then, it carried a lot more weight when you made the Pro Bowl. So that's kind of a sort of a Kodak moment. Quick look at what happened in the draft of '89. So I would say the little footnotes are most interesting about it, like Aikman showing up and being the first player that really showed up and then starting the trend now. The juniors being eligible because of Barry Sanders is cool. And then just the volume of Pro Bowlers and Hall of Famers that were in there. And then the little personal connection about you and I actually seeing Steve Atwater go in and him being a former Razorback. That's pretty cool too. What else do you want to note or remember? Or, by the way, Tony Mandrich totally, from what I can gather, he totally changed his life around, and I think he owns his own multimedia company now, where he got into photography and camera work and stuff after his playing career, and he moved, I want to say Arizona or California or somewhere, and went into business for himself. And I think he's written a book where he basically says, hey, I screwed up. I wasn't the right kind of mentally. I didn't handle this right at the time and didn't do things the right way. But apparently he's turned his life around, which is really good to hear.
Yep.
I know I did most of the talking, but you do know a shockingly lot of information about stuff from back then, because you're good about your YouTube and reading stuff. So anything else you got about it?
I don't think so.
1989 NFL draft. Well, I will tell you how it goes when we talk about the 83, because some of these old guys want to talk about it, because what happened in the 83 draft? A lot of quarterbacks, yeah. All right, Dylan, I appreciate you helping your old man out on a couple of episodes here, and we will pick another topic and get back together soon, all right?
Good.
All right, bye.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.